Thank you, Mike. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I can see that I need to alter my title to The Stuff and Public Health. But more seriously, it's great to see so many people in the auditorium tonight that are potentially interested in this topic. I want to start by basically just stating something pretty obvious. We wouldn't drink that glass of water, would we? And we wouldn't eat that moldy bread. I mean, it's pretty clear that neither of those two things would be good for ourselves. It would make us sick. So the question is, why should we accept breathing dirty air? And we do. We're doing it every day. Some of us more than others, depending where we live and how we commute. But those are three fundamental activities that keep us alive. And we're very clear about two of them being wrong. But it seems as if we've sort of missed out on understanding this third one. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight and give you some background information. So that's the title, Air Pollution and Public Health, Emerging Hazards and Improved Understanding of Risk. I want to start off with just giving you some background. It's not all traffic. So there's many, many different sources of pollution. Basically, power generation is a big source, depending on the fuel which is used. Clearly, road traffic is as well. Shipping is an enormous source of pollution, but generally it's away from where we live. So again, we don't really think about it. But there has been a long road to get us to actually improve emissions from shipping. And just at the beginning of this year, on the 1st of January, the sulfur content of all international shipping has been reduced from 3.5% down to 0.5%. And this should make a big difference as we move forward. There's lots of industries as well which generate pollution. And of course, we've been hearing increasingly horrible accounts for what's happening over in Australia and Indonesia, California, these wildfires. And all of these different sources of pollution involve some form of combustion. So we're burning something. This last one is a natural form of pollution, desert dust. And it is a big problem in the Middle East, especially where we now have increasingly large cities which produce these other types of pollution, and you have this mixing up of the natural and the anthropogenic, which is leading to a lot of respiratory problems in the Middle East. Now, this isn't new. We have been combusting things for a long, long time, and we've been exposed to those emissions for a long time. And modern science, looking at Egyptian and Argentinian mummies, have shown that they have a condition very similar to emphysema, which is the condition that you used to be called whenever you were a smoker and you got lung problems. CT scans of Peruvian mummies have shown that they have a condition very, very similar to what we now call COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So this is very simple exposure and disease outcomes, and it's been there for centuries. But if we move forward in the 20th century UK or London, then if you remember, the Industrial Revolution depended on the burning of fossil fuels. Everything was dependent on them to begin with. Our shipping, our trains, our transport, our power generation, the heating of our homes. And of course, this led to enormous pollution problems. This is a scene from the archives. It's 1950s London. We don't think about this anymore unless we're thinking about Asia, where we see lots of people walking around with these masks on. But it happened, of course, here just a generation or two ago. We had scenes like this. Apparently this was a match at Highbury, which was abandoned after 10 minutes for obvious reasons. But then, more seriously, you'll all have read about, or some of you may remember, this great London smog, the first week of December in 1952, whenever for 1 week we had weather conditions which basically trapped all the pollution that was being generated in London within the greater London area. It just couldn't escape, it couldn't disperse. And as a result, concentrations of black smoke and sulfur dioxide increased enormously. This is a photograph taken in Trafalgar Square. There's one of the lions, and apparently the photograph was taken at noon. So that is the sun, not the moon up there. And as a consequence of this, when the statistics were examined a few months later, the health statistics, then there was, as well as this dramatic increase in smoke and sulfur dioxide concentration over this first week of December, there was also a dramatic increase in the death rate. And if you add up all the extra deaths under that peak there, it comes to somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 extra deaths that happened, depending where you think this comes back to normal. Now, this is not obviously cause and effect, but it is, you can see, a very clear association. Subsequently, research showed that this probably was cause and effect, but at the time, it was just, we're getting all this pollution, more people are dying. There must be some connection between the two. And as a consequence of this, then, we had the Clean Air Act introduced 4 years later in Parliament, and this basically banned the burning of coal within city limits. So all the power stations were reproduced outside the city, and the ones in the city were closed down. You were not allowed to burn coal in your home for heating or cooking purposes by law. And as a consequence, you can see from the mid-1950s onwards, we had a dramatic decrease in the concentration of these two pollutants, sulfur dioxide, a gas, and black smoke or black carbon, the particles that you get from burning coal. And of course, when the question was asked in the early 90s, do we have an air pollution problem anymore in the UK? The answer on most people's lips were, no, we've solved the problem. And in fact, there was an MRC research unit that had been set up to investigate this issue, which closed down because it was generally thought the problem had been solved. But if you go through the history books, you generally will find that when we solve one issue as a race, we tend to generate another one. And there was another one coming up rapidly behind the coal issue. And, I should say, this, again, demonstrating how effective this law was, and that's the good news tonight. Certain laws, if they're the right ones, and regulations can really be beneficial to ourselves, to human public health. So this is a picture of Bankside, one of the big power stations along the Thames in 1952. This is it today, and of course it does generate smoke anymore, but it's one of the major modern art galleries in the world. It's the Tate Modern. And there's a whole series of these power stations along the river which have been turned into other facilities. But as I said, once we solve one problem, then generally we're hit by another one. So the one that was coming behind the coal issue was the annual distance travelled by roads in the UK. And this is actually really, really dramatic when you think about it. So here back in the 1950s, the roads were not that great in length or coverage of the country, and the number of people who owned motor vehicles was quite small. And we're looking here at annual vehicle distance travelled in billions of kilometres. So back there in 1950, it was around about 50 billion kilometres per year. And you can see that then over the next several decades, we come up here to 2014, you can see we're up to 10 times that amount of distance travelled on the roads in the UK. And the vast majority of that is here, cars and taxis, with light vans making up the next biggest part of the jigsaw. So we had gone from burning coal, burning this fossil fuel coal, which is really dirty and giving us these pollutants, black smoke, sulfur dioxide, to burning initially petrol and then increasingly diesel, which was giving us a different type of pollutant, these very small particles, and a gas called nitrogen dioxide. And if you go into any of our towns or any of our cities these days, then it's quite often that you see situations like this. Congested roads, vehicles not working efficiently, and producing, obviously, a lot of tailpipe emissions. And those tailpipe emissions, as I say, the pollutants which we're going to think about for the rest of the evening are these tiny particles, PM2.5, and this gas, initially oxides of nitrogen, but the damaging part being nitrogen dioxide. And these are the modern pollutants which we think are linked with a whole range of health effects. So, we still have days, this is London of course, but we still have days when London looks like this. It's not every day, it's probably a maximum of 10 to 12 days a year now, but it still happens. And it's not because London is producing more pollution, it's because of the weather conditions associated with that particular day. And two things are happening. It could be that the pollution that London is generating is not being dispersed because maybe there's a cold air front and it's trapping the pollution in the city. Or it may be that there's actually a lot of weather fronts which is bringing a lot of pollution in from the continent, even from Poland, where they're still burning a lot of coal for their power generation. So pollution is generated in one location and gets moved on to another location. And of course, many days, the pollution that we produce in our large cities is moving across onto the continent as well. So that's why if you're going to have regulation to improve this situation, it's not just, you just can't take one city, you can't take one country, you can't take one region. It is an international issue. We've all got to step up to the mark. So that's the current situation. What I want to do now is move on to why we think this is a problem and consider what the health effects are. And I find it easier here to talk about the short-term health effects and the long-term health effects. And they're actually very different, and you can estimate them and measure them in different ways. So let's think about, first of all, the short-term health effects. So this is when we have a pollution episode. The pollution increases above what it would be on a normal day. What are the impacts of that? Where do we see those impacts? So, go to the UK ambulance service data. This is data back from 2015. At the beginning of 2015, we had 2 major air pollution episodes across the country. On the first one, when you look at the data and you compare that to the same time in previous years, when there wasn't a pollution episode, you find that there was 1,200 additional hospital consultations. During the second episode, which was longer and a bit worse, then there was twice that number nearly, 2,300 additional hospital consultations. So these hospital consultations weren't for people maybe like you and I, mostly. These were for people who had an established problem, an established disease. They may have had asthma, they may have had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, they may have had a previous heart attack. There'll be something which meant that generally their health is a little bit compromised. And it's those people who seem to be a little bit more susceptible whenever the pollution concentration rises. It's not the healthy young individuals. They generally can tolerate this change in atmospheric conditions. So that's where you see these short-term health effects generally in people who already have a problem medically. If we go to 2017, then this is data which comes from what's called the London Air Quality Network. So London has over 120 fixed-site regulatory monitors. This is the really high-level sampling and analysis equipment, which allows us to have confidence in the data and which we have been up until this time, reporting back to Europe to see whether we're meeting the air quality standards or not. So you can see the first episode back in January, the scale here is 1 to 10. So anything 1, 2, 3 is green. Anything above that, you're starting to go moderate or high or very high pollution. You can see January was a very bad air pollution episode. The February one was quite bad at 6s and 7s, and then these latter ones were not quite so bad. But that's just as an example to say, you may think to yourself, well, you know, we don't really have bad air pollution anymore. We do have really bad air pollution, but we only have it a few days a year, as I explained. And you really need to, you either have to be very sensitive to this, and then you'll feel it yourself, or you have to go to the websites to see that it's happening. The other way in which we can think about pollution is not as it changes with time, but as it changes spatially. So what we have here, again, is a surface of Greater London. And this is, what we've done is we've added up all the emissions of a gas, nitrogen dioxide, from all the sources. So this will be from vehicles, it'll be from gas boilers, it'll be from industrial units. All that information goes into a large model, a dispersion model, and it puts out this surface. And this is the scale here, and the cut point for NO2 on an annual average basis is 40 micrograms per meter cubed. It should not be exceeded, or there will be increased health effects. And you can see that anything that's yellow, orange, red, or purple is above this limit value. Well, what's lighting up here? It's central London, and it's all the road network. So this is clearly demonstrating that vehicles on the roads are the major sources of this pollutant. And they're emitting so much pollution, then if you live along one of these arteries, or you're moving along one of these arteries, then you're going to be exposed to increased concentrations of NO2, which the WHO has indicated is not good for your health. Now, that means that, as you probably know, road transport is the issue. But in that you're putting all these emissions together to begin with into the model, you can then go back and you can think about, well, where are the major sources of NO2 emissions? And it's simply, in most cities, it's road transport. It's not the only source, but it's the major source. And then if you break that down, that 58% of emissions of NO2, if you break that down into vehicle categories, then it's quite quickly you see that it's TfL buses, which are all diesel, other buses, which are diesel, Arctic HGVs, rigid HGVs, all diesel, taxis, mostly diesel, diesel private cars. The vast majority of these emissions of NO2 are diesel vehicles. And that's why if you've been following this media coverage, that's why diesel has come under increased attack, because it is a major source of one of the major pollutants in our cities, nitrogen dioxide. And that's why we are breaking the law on this particular pollutant. And that's why there are regulations being brought in the UK, in different cities, and across Europe to try and bring this issue under control. But with that sort of information, you can, like we did back in 1956, you can come up with a regulation which is directly aimed at dealing with the problem. And the regulation here is, if we manage to deal with diesel, then we should be able to reduce these emissions of NO2 to a large extent. So we're going to move now on to some evidence. We've seen the numbers, we've seen the sources, that's all pretty logical, but what's the evidence that breathing these pollutants in actually causes health problems and diseases down the line? So to do this work, we started it back in the late 80s, early 90s. We couldn't find any facilities in the UK to do exposures of humans to these pollutants and measure the response. We had to go to the University of Umeå, which is in northern Sweden. Two reasons. One, northern Sweden air is pretty damn clean. There's very little pollution up there. And secondly, the Swedes are very environmentally conscious, and they decided to put money into this research long before anything was recognized here in the UK. So at the university, they have a facility, an exposure facility. This is the sort of the factory floor side of the facility. This is a large Volvo diesel engine That's the exhaust of it there. And that exhaust, when the engine's running, is bled down. And what comes through this wall, which is this wall here, is about it's about 95% dilution of the original exhaust. So what happens when that exhaust comes into this chamber? It's been running for a while. You're experiencing small particle concentrations and NO2 concentrations, the two main components of diesel exhaust, along the sort of lines that you would get if you went up and down Oxford Street in London. But what we have here is we have a willing volunteer sitting on a bicycle doing a bit of exercise, and they are totally in our control, as it were. We can take samples from them before they go into the exposure chamber and whenever they come out of the exposure chamber. But in reality, what we do is, on one occasion, they will be in here and there'll be diesel coming into the chamber. And on another occasion, maybe a month apart, there'll be just pure air coming in to the chamber. Now, it's not totally blinded because you can't actually smell diesel, but that gives us a control of the same individual when they're exposed to diesel. And that is a really good experimental design. So once they've had their exposure and they come out of the chamber, maybe it's a two-hour exposure, we know exactly what they've been exposed to. We bring them into the room next door, and they undergo what's called fiber optic bronchoscopy. So what this allows us to do, it allows you to enter a flexible bronchoscope down into the airways, and you can do various things with that technique. You can have a little camera on the end of it, so you can actually look at their airways, at the surface, to see if it's inflamed or not. You can have a little set of calipers on the end of it, and you can actually take a tissue sample and bring that out and analyze that in the laboratory. Or you can even have a little tube associated with it where you can squirt some saline onto the surface of the airway and then suck that back up. And that gives you a sample, a fluid sample of what's going on the surface of the lung. In this particular example here, what we've done is we've squirted that saline in and we've pulled it back. And what we're doing is we're looking at the cells which we've captured that were roaming on the surface of that individual's lung. Now these cells, they're your immune cells. You might know them as being white cells. They're the ones that go round your body protecting you from the external environment. So protects you from viruses and bacteria and any sort of foreign material. So what this cell does, this macrophage, is if it sees something foreign, it will basically wrap itself around it and eat it up. Now, in this particular situation, it's not seeing any viruses or bacteria or foreign material. Well, it's seeing foreign material, and that foreign material, it's eaten up. And this here, when you analyze it, is diesel soot. It's black carbon. Now, that macrophage has done its job because it's protecting that individual from that diesel soot. But unfortunately, if you're a cell biologist, by looking at the rest of the cell, you can see that as a consequence of doing that, it's now going through a cell death process. So although it's protected the individual at that point in time, it's not going to be there in a couple of hours to provide further protection. And you're going to need that cell to be replaced if you're going to maintain your normal defense system. And this is a consistent finding that you see whenever you do any of these diesel chamber studies. If you're a healthy individual, then you can deal with it. But by dealing with it, your immune system is being compromised. And imagine if this happens every day for a week, a month, a year, 10 years, 2 decades, 3 decades. We think that eventually that immune system will be compromised. And that's one of the reasons why this pollution seems to be leading to disease situations. So, I mentioned Oxford Street. Here it is. Or this is what it used to look like maybe about 5 years ago. It was just a continual train of red buses. And it dawned on me one day, we're always talking about doing these chamber studies in northern Sweden. And then I thought, well, why don't we do the studies in Oxford Street? Because we now have the ability to do it. The equipment has all been miniaturized. We can take the individuals in and out. We can bring them into the hospital afterwards and do the bronchoscopy or whatever. So we actually have done a number of studies on Oxford Street. I'm going to show you one. here. This is one which we did with asthmatics. So we had about 20 asthmatics, and on one occasion, we walked them up and down Oxford Street for 2 hours. They did a bit of window shopping. This is one of our students behind them, and you can see he's wearing a backpack, and this backpack has lots of miniaturized equipment which measures the black carbon concentrations, the NO2 concentrations, and everything else that we think we need to know. And then on another occasion, again, usually about 3 weeks apart, we take them to Hyde Park, and they have this nice walk around the Round Pond. And even though this is only 1.5 miles distance, and they're both in London, there is a big difference in pollution exposure on those 2 hours. And as I say, we're able to measure that, because there's the backpack again, measuring exactly what they're breathing. So, one time the individual's being exposed to real-world diesel pollution, because it's all red buses and black cabs in Oxford Street. That's all you get, diesel pollution. And another time, their exposure is much, much less in Hyde Park. So what's the data that we find? Well, this is a graph of FEV1, which is forced expiratory volume in 1 second. It's how good your lung function is, or at least it's one of the measures of how good your lung function is. And what we're doing here is we're looking at lung function during the walk, there's the 2-hour walk, and then for a series of hours after the walk. And you can see that when they walked around Hyde Park, there is a small but non-significant decrease in lung function. You expect that whenever you're actually walking, you do see a slight drop. But when they were in Oxford Street, the same individuals showed a much greater drop in their lung function. And this is simply by being on a shopping street where they're being exposed to diesel pollution. And what surprised us most was when we actually brought them back the next day, then there was still a dip in their lung function. So that 2-hour exposure had quite a lasting compromise effect on them. So that study was done in people with asthma. We've subsequently done a study last year in people with cardiovascular disease, and we found a similar sort of effect, but not this time in their lungs, but in their blood vessels. So again, if you exercise, your blood vessels release chemicals which allow more blood to move to your muscles where you need it. If they were in Oxford Street, then you didn't see that release of chemicals in the same way, and their blood vessels stayed more contracted. So that was a negative effect. We also did the study in patients with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and again, we saw lung issues with them. So there's just this modern world when you're out in a city, depending on the quality of the air going into your lungs, can affect your body in quite a marked way, even in an acute marked way. So I think this is the final bit of evidence I want to show you for these sort of effects. This is a study in children in East London, and we were particularly interested in what the effect of these vehicle emissions were having on these children as they were growing up. Because, of course, when you're born, you're very small. You've got a very small lung. As you grow, your chest expands, your lung grows. Get up to about the age of 18, most things are over then. Your lungs reach its biggest volume. You will keep that probably for the next 10 years. Nothing will really happen. And then from the age of 28 to 30, you'll start to lose about 100 mils of lung volume every year. That's just a natural aging process. So there had been some reports that exposure to air pollution actually reduced the early growth of children's lungs. And if that happens, and if they don't reach the age of 18 and they haven't had the chance to catch up that lung growth, then they carry that smaller lung with them through the rest of their life. And that's not a good thing to happen from a health viewpoint. So that was the question we were looking at. One of the things we did was we found out where they lived and where they were going to school, and some of them were walking along busy artery roads. We didn't do lavage on them, but what we did was we did a process called induced sputum, where you just basically You get them to cough up after you've given them some salt solution, and it brings up some of their respiratory fluid contents. And in that, you can actually find these macrophages again. And here's a kid who walked along a busy road that morning to school, and there's the diesel, evidence of the diesel exposure that they had there. And you can see this cell here is like the one I showed you earlier. It's beginning to die off because of this exposure. So in the real world, this is happening as well. It's happening to children. When we looked at their exposures, we looked at their annual exposure to NO2 at their home postcode, so where they lived. And remember that magic number of 40 micrograms per meter cubed? Well, the majority, 85% of the children in East London, outside their front door, there was more than 40 micrograms per meter cubed of NO2. That's how bad the situation was when we did this. This study was done about 5 years ago. The average forced vital capacity, that's the size of your lung, was 1.89 litres in normal children, not exposed to NO2 concentrations in these locations. When we did some measurements, and this is the children that were exposed to below the standard, so 35 micrograms per meter cubed, we found that they had a slightly smaller lung. It was about 5% smaller than the average. And when we went into some of these upper margins here, a child being exposed to 55 micrograms per meter cubed NO2, then they'd lost nearly 9% of their lung volume compared to a lower exposed group. And this is getting into a clinically significant depreciation of lung growth. So this is a really, really bad situation here where you have people living, probably because of their social circumstances, in locations near busy roads where they can't prevent being exposed because they've got to go out their front door, they've got to walk along that road to go to school, etc. So this is more reason why we need regulation to ensure this isn't happening much more. So that was sort of some of the short-term health effects. Just go on to some of the long-term ones. This is where you move away from just looking at individuals, and you've got to start looking at populations, large numbers of individuals that have the power to see the effect. And I'm just going to remind you that these tiny, tiny particles which we're talking about is really, really an issue. And if you look at this human hair I've just pulled out of my head, 60 micrometers in diameter, you can't see it. So there's no way you're going to be able to see any of these particles. PM10, 10 micrometers, PM2.5, less than 2.5 micrometers. You can get 24 of those across a human hair. So they will go down. If you breathe them in, they will go down into your lung. And the smaller they are, the deeper they'll go into your lung. So the particle where we have the most information, the most associations with health effects is this here, PM2.5. And that's partly because a lot of the research has been done in America. They were onto this issue very early on, and their regulatory system was based more on 2.5 than ours was on PM10 for the early years. So that's where most of the health evidence exists. But we now have a lot of data now in Europe as well, which supports the earlier American data. So, we're putting a question to you, is there safe to breathe when most days look like this? Remember I said we only have 10 or 12 bad days. We have a lot of days where if you look up, it's blue sky. And that's quite misleading, because if you're in a city like London, if you go up high, and this is from the top of St. Thomas's Hospital, and you look out across the city, then quite often there is this haze. And that is a haze of nitrogen dioxide and these tiny, tiny particles. So it's there, but it's just you can't see it normally. It's invisible. So when there's a committee, government committee, Department of Health and Social Sciences Committee, the Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollution, when they looked at all the evidence, looking at the mortality effects of long-term exposure to particulate air pollution in the United Kingdom, published a decade ago now, their conclusions were, across the UK, poor air quality measured as PM2.5 was associated with a total loss of population life of 340,000 life years. Now, these are mathematical calculations. It depends on the size of the population. It depends on their exposure. But that's what comes out of the equation at the end of it. Now, that's pretty meaningless to you and I. So if you put that another way, if you take everybody in the country aged over 30 and average it out, it means we're all losing about 6 months of life. But of course, that's not the right way of doing it either. It's just one way of talking about it. It means that those people who are exposed to a lot of pollution and are maybe a little bit compromised and sensitive to it, they're probably losing several years of life. And then there's other lucky people who are probably only losing a few days of life. So it'll be spread out across the population. But another way of talking about it, and this is the figure which you normally hear about in the media, air pollution measured as PM2.5 is equivalent to 29,000. We've actually revised this now 2 years ago, and it's between 28,000 and 36,000 premature deaths. That's given the uncertainty we have in the number. Now, the reason it's important to come up with a number like that is it allows you to compare this risk, this hazard, against other hazards in life. So the biggest hazard we have for our health is smoking, equivalent to about 89,000 deaths a year, the biggest problem we have. The second biggest problem is this. If you want to consider obesity, if you want to consider alcohol-related deaths, you're down around 12 to 14,000 a year. Road accidents, fatalities, around 2,500 a year. So this is the second biggest hazard we have to public health. And that's why, we're beginning to worry more about it. We need to do something about it. Some evidence, again, coming from studies to suggest, what's going on here. This is a study that came out of Germany back in 2007. These investigators, basically, they just looked at where people lived, how close they lived to be a major road. And the closer that you came in to the house to the road, then the increased risk that you had for calcification of your arteries. And that's another way of saying you've got heart disease. So you get these big, thick walls in your arteries due to laying down of calcium. And so there was something about living close to busy roads, probably partly due to the exposure. Maybe it was due to other lifestyle factors, because, again, we know that housing's cheaper, and there's many other issues as well. But there's many lines of evidence to say there's something about exposure to the vehicle emissions. That's important for health. So this is a WHO cartoon. The death bit is the easy bit to calculate. But actually, as you go down through this pyramid, more and more people are being brought into the problem. So we've got more people going to the doctors, requiring more medication, having more symptoms, having impaired lung function. And then everybody is down here, these subclinical effects, that when you breathe in this pollution, your body will respond to it, as I've showed you those macrophage experiments. But whether you know that that's happening or not really depends on your situation and your health. If you're interested in the topic and you want to follow it up after this evening's lecture, this is a report that came out from 2 of the Royal Colleges back in 2016. It's called Every Breath We Take, the Lifelong Impact of Air Pollution. So when I was talking at dinner tonight, when I started my career, all my focus was on the lung and how the lung was being damaged by what we breathe in. It now turns out that, in fact, every part of our lifespan, the unborn child, the growing child, the adult, and the elderly, there is linkages between what you breathe, how long you've been breathing that stuff, and your health situation or your disease occurrence. There's very good evidence for all these different conditions now. So that report is available online should you be interested. So, going back to the issue, urban areas, too much traffic. A lot of that traffic historically is diesel-related traffic in our cities. Do you believe that if you get the traffic off the roads, you actually see the pollution disappear? You would think you should, shouldn't you? So here's a natural experiment which actually demonstrates this. This is the Oxford Street bus strike back in 2015. Here's the NO2 concentration going down at night, coming up during the day. This is Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, bus strike. Now, there's still some pollution there because the taxis were still going up and down Oxford Street, but the buses weren't. So if you can remove that source of pollution from the roads, you will quickly improve air quality. So that again gives us hope that we can do something about this. Another good example of this is Christmas shopping days in Regent Street in London. About 4 Sundays in December, they closed down this bottom half of Regent Street to traffic. They leave the top half open, so there's buses and cars and everything going along there, and there's buses and taxis going along Oxford Street. This is measurements of black carbon, which is a reflection of diesel. You can see here these numbers are a lot lower, the yellows, than the reds. So again, you just remove the traffic, prevent it coming in to the streets, and you will get improved air quality quite quickly. Improving public awareness is an essential aspect of this. I don't know if you all came along tonight understanding that there is a problem here, or whether you've learnt something about that problem tonight. But I think it's one of the major feelings that we've had is that we've kept this far too quiet, and we need to make sure that people's understanding improves, because we're all part of the problem, so we can all be part of the solution as well. So this is an ad that Transport for London put out a few years ago. It's actually, this is a key in a vehicle, steering column with a little plastic heart hanging from it, and it says a small switch could help cut heart disease. Basically what they were trying to do was encouraging White Van Man to turn off his engine whenever he was unloading or loading up his vehicle, so to prevent the idling emissions, which were not helping anyone. There's been a number of campaigns like this. It's also really important to improve politicians' understanding of the issue, and that is happening to some extent as well. In London, we've had 3 elected mayors. We had Ken Livingstone, we had Boris Johnson, and now we've got Sadiq Khan. And Ken Livingstone was quite progressive in this area. Boris was pretty neutral about it. He didn't really push forward many helpful things. Sadiq Khan has been totally different. He came in with 5 things around knife crime and housing and whatever, but one of them was air pollution, improving air quality. And the reason he did it was because he's an asthmatic, and I think 2 of his children are asthmatic, so he actually understands the challenge. So within 5 days of coming into office, my phone rang, and he said, he didn't say Frank, he said, Professor Kelly, can I borrow one of those small instruments that you have for measuring air quality? So this is an ethylometer, measures black carbon, and he went off, or one of his aides went off, got it, and then he went on Oxford Street, standing between 2 buses, and came out with a big statement saying, I'm going to introduce the ultra-low emission zone into London, which will really hopefully improve air quality during my office. And this is the ULEZ, which came into central London. It's 3 stages. First one came in last year. It penalises older vehicles, so older vehicles have more emissions. This year, October, I think it is, it's meant to go out to the M25. The initial bit was only in the central congestion charging scheme. Everything that comes in through the M25 barrier that's large is going to have to be of a certain engine emission level, or it has to pay a big fine. And then the proposal is that in 21, then everything gets expanded out, even private vehicles, to the north and south circular. and you have to have a really clean car, or you're again paying a lot of money. This, unfortunately, I think is one of the reasons why he may not get re-elected in May again, because this is not going to be popular. It's going to cost a lot of people a lot of money. But when the models are run and when the calculations are done, if you want to bring us into WHO air quality territory to meet those guidelines, that's the sort of thing that you need to do in a large city. Other things he's done, I'm getting to the end now, so just a few pictures. Other things he's done, he's introduced the electric cab in London. If you've been in one of them, or if you haven't been in one of them, I fully recommend it. This is the only type of cab I would dream of driving in now. They're really, really good and no tailpipe emissions. Introduced electric buses. These are in London. The double-decker ones are under trial at the moment, and they're also now going into a number of other towns and cities across the UK. Increasingly, I think we'll see pedestrianised areas in our towns and city centres where we'll just ban vehicles from them, and this should help a lot. This is my last slide, and this is the one to cheer you up, because if you thought it was bad in the UK, this is China. There's 44 lanes of traffic here coming into Beijing, and you can see them going through the toll barrier here and squeezing down into about 12 lanes. Absolutely crazy. And this isn't the worst situation in the world. So we are pretty much ahead of the game in respect to the way we're thinking about dealing with the issue. There's other countries are way, way behind us, but that doesn't mean to say we should be complacent, because the health of people in the UK has been and still is being affected by poor air quality. So thank you very much for your attention. That's the end of the presentation. Very happy to take any questions.
Well, Professor Kelly, that was absolutely smashing. We have a rather unusual question regime here. It used to be I chose who I liked, but thought I only favoured old white men, so I was banned. And nowadays, we have my two charming assistants here, and they'll go side from side. They will, if you want to ask a question, you have to catch their eye, and then we'll go side and side about. The first question over there, please.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. As an asthmatic, I really appreciate all of those things, and I find just the same, the difference between the air quality of Cambridge and London is just really marked when you come back out into the fresh air again. Have you done any work on emissions within the vehicles themselves, within diesel vehicles? Because I've often thought that there must be something coming into the cars, and whether that sort of affects your lung function or your heart function or anything of that nature.
Yes, good question. We and others have done work over the last few years, because again, the miniaturized equipment's available to be able to make those measurements. I was asked this question at dinner as well, and I said, basically, if you're in a vehicle in a congested stream of traffic, you are in a gas chamber. And that's because you, unless your ventilation is on recirculation, the fumes from the vehicle in front will be coming directly into your cabin. If your windows are open, they'll be coming in that way as well. And basically, we find that the pollution concentration increases. It gets trapped, so more comes in than goes out. So you must, if you're in traffic and you're sensitive to pollution, or even if you're not, you need to put your ventilation on recirculation, you need to close your windows, and you need to keep a good distance from the vehicle, the tailpipe in front. We've also done studies with professional drivers, and again, some of the information is horrendous. You know, if you're a taxi driver in a major city, then you're being exposed, to 10, 20 times the average individual. So there's a real occupational issue as well with drivers.
Hello, thank you for your talk. You touched briefly at the beginning with a photo from London in the 1950s of people wearing masks. and you said that the only real place that you see that these days is in Asia. Have there been any research to show that the masks produce statistically significant benefits to wearing them, and would it be worth Londoners investing in them? Obviously, you want to tackle the cause.
Absolutely.
That's more important. But for the person on the street,
Yeah.
are the masks helpful?
Yeah. So the masks that were in that photograph are not helpful. They're only for photographic opportunity. For a mask to be efficient, it needs to deal with two things. It needs to deal with the particles. So that means it needs a really fine mesh makeup. And also to deal with the gases, it needs an activated charcoal filter. So if you put all that together, then you're talking about quite an expensive mask. I would have thought maybe 20, 25 pounds for a decent one. There are some cycle masks which serve those capabilities. But the next thing is, I don't think you can go in and just buy a mask and have it fit your face, because if there's any movement of air outside, between your skin and the mask itself, again, it won't be doing its job. It'll only be doing half a job. So it's a really, really difficult area. I don't generally support their use, but clearly if you feel, that you are sensitive to air pollution, you can probably, if you have to be in that situation, you can probably reduce it, but you have to be very, very careful.
Thank you. I was most impressed with your experiments up in Sweden, and I'm really impressed about how you've taken those forward to look at the fate of the pollutants actually in the human body. Now, I was a practitioner in air quality research for 25 years, from 1970 onwards, and none of that sort of thing was going on here. And I think that it's a shame it took such a long time to find out actually how the pollutants are acting on the body. One point I would like to ask you is, you talked about two main pollutants causing the problems today. One was PM 2.5 and the other is nitrogen dioxide. Well, nitrogen dioxide is a gas, and PM 2.5 is a particle. And does the body have any distinction in pathways between those two pollutants? And do we really know which one is the problem, if not both?
So, the respiratory tract is lined with a fluid on the outside. The respiratory tract lining fluid or lung lining fluid, from your nose right down to the deepest alveoli. In that fluid, we've found that there is a whole range of interesting molecules. You'd probably know about them as being called antioxidants. So there's very low molecular weight ones, reduced glutathione, GSH, ascorbic acid, uric acid. Now, those antioxidants are really, really good at dealing with the gas, NO2, because NO2 is a free radical and antioxidants react with free radicals. The particles are totally different. So they have reactive components and chemicals on their surface. So I personally think that they are carriers. They're carbon cores, they're covered in chemicals. I personally think that they carry those chemicals down into the airways, and then those particles will go through the lung fluid, and there'll be some interactions going on, but they'll probably interact with the lung cell surface, or even if they're small enough, go into those lung cells. So yes, different pathways we think are involved. Is NO2 or PM 2.5 the worst? We don't know. The strongest evidence is for PM 2.5, but that's because more research has been done, I think, in North America. North America doesn't have a diesel problem, so it's not interested in NO2. So it's really Europe catching up now and putting some money into that research.
Thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. Thank you for the combination of visuals and words together. I've got two questions, if I may. And one of your early pie charts showed that the vast majority of the pollution is produced by buses. but later on, the policies don't seem to be focusing on buses. They seem to be being more general than that. So I was wondering why that is. Why are we focusing on electric cars when, in fact, if the problem is primarily buses? And the second question is there not a technical solution to the particle emissions from diesel buses?
So, I didn't show you the data if you actually take the number of each of those vehicles and calculated their pollution contribution. So again, I'm sorry, most of my knowledge is to do with London fleet. So we have 8,000 buses in London. We have 23,000 black cabs in London. And then we've got somewhere between 100 to 200,000 private vehicles that come into London on a regular basis. If you actually add up the emissions of those different vehicle fleets, the buses are a major contributor to the problem. So that's why they are being targeted. So all the there's not been a new single-decker diesel bus bought in London since 2017, and they're desperate to buy double-decker electrics when they are available. All the new ones have been hybrid ones. So there is a bus policy. You asked could the problem not be solved? Yes. So the modern, it's Euro 6C now, I think, is where we're at with the emission standards. And that tailpipe emission from a 2020 Euro 6C bus is dramatically cleaner than anything that's come before it. It's not perfect, and some people like myself worry that it will require a lot of maintenance to keep it really clean. So it can be done, but it's expensive, and it's probably not the future, I think, burning fossil fuel.
No.
Yep.
It's a question about black cabs in London. Am I right in thinking that at the moment they're exempt from low emissions standards? And if we wanted to change that, would it help to publicise among the relevant people, I mean the people in the black cabs themselves, drivers, the effects on the drivers themselves, the effects of the drivers themselves of this, of the pollution that they are getting, never mind everybody else?
Yeah. So they are aware of it. I mean, we have done studies with them. We have published the findings in their newsletters. So I think every black cab driver is aware that they have an occupational challenge. What has been done to try and deal with the black cab problem is, and I'll probably get the exact data wrong, but this is from memory. Originally, I think they had a license period of 16 years. It's either 15 or 16 years. That has been reduced now down to 12 years. So the cab will not have a license after 12 years. Unfortunately, what I think is it goes from London to another UK town to be used. But to try and encourage them to move away from, even to come out sooner than 12 years, there have been large grants. There's been a government grant of, I think it's 7,000, and there's been a GLA grant of 5,000. So £12,000 was available to taxi drivers for the last 2 to 3 years to move their vehicle into a cleaner version.
Thank you. I wondered if I could ask you about a non-transport matter, and perhaps just to comment on the relative importance of non-transport to transport matters. Particularly, I wanted to ask you about wood-burning stoves and solid fuel stoves. We've heard quite a lot about this, I think. And I think at one time there was a sort of a movement growing that they should actually be fully banned, not just because of the pollution outside the home, but also inside. And I just wondered if you could comment on that and how important it is relative to transport and whether, in fact, these things should be banned or curtailed in some way.
So this is another issue that sort of crept up on us. And really, it was only about 18 months ago that new activity was undertaken by DEFRA, which actually came out with the prediction that, in fact, about 30% to 35% of all our PM emissions in the UK was coming from burning wood. Now, that that was a total shock to most people. So what has happened is, I think in the last decade, the wood burning stove has become quite popular again, and people have been encouraged to put them into their homes because there are ones that are called DEFRA approved, and those ones are basically better than the non-DEFRA approved ones. But if you burn any solid fuel, you will produce a lot of pollution. That pollution, if it's a DEFRA approved one, apparently is not, it's pretty well sealed. It's not coming into your house as much as a non-DEFRA approved one. But of course, as you said, it's all going out the chimney. And if you walk past any property that's got a wood burner, you can smell it. So there's a lot of issue there. The government are not going to ban them. They've said that. But what they are doing is they recognise that if wood is properly conditioned, dried out, usually kiln dried, to bring the moisture content down below 20%, then that will burn as efficiently as a fossil fuel will. So that's what they're doing. They're sort of putting the pressure on wood sales to make sure that it's dry, well-conditioned wood. But it is an issue.
There are many trade-offs here. And if you're living in a large city, would it be better to ride a bicycle and be exposed to fumes, or to be in a vehicle, such as a bus, with recirculating air within it? The benefits of cycling and exercise against the increased pollution, I presume. Have you looked at that?
Yeah, so I haven't done personally, but other researchers have, and you're right. Generally, it's thought that the benefit of exercise will always outweigh the disbenefit of breathing in bad air. But I think we can go one better than that, because it's pretty clear where, you saw from that map, it's pretty clear where you would get most exposure. It's on the busy, congested roads. So if you're riding on your bike, get the exercise, yes, but don't ride behind a bus. Go down the side street and, take a longer route, get a bit more exercise. And in fact, one of the things we've been able to do for Londoners is, because we have this surface of pollution, what we've done is we've joined that information up. We run those models every hour. We've joined that information up with Google Maps. So what you're able to do is you're able to put in your origin, your home, and your destination, maybe work, and it'll give you the quickest route. But then straight away, it'll give you another route, and it'll say, this will take you 10 minutes longer by whatever way you're going, but you'll reduce your exposure by 20%. And then it gives you a third route, and it says, this will take you 30 minutes longer, twice as long, but you'll reduce your exposure by 50%. So there is information out there to help people minimize their exposure until we get this sorted out. Well, make sure you don't have the wood burner on.
Thank you very much. A very interesting talk. Could I just ask, would it not be easy to pass a bylaw which said that you just simply had to switch off your engine at a red light? They've had this for years in Switzerland, and we could do it locally, I think. I'm sure Nicola will be able to tell us. We could just pass a law saying every red light, switch the engine off. Would that make any appreciable difference or not?
It's difficult, because depending on whether your engine's been warmed up or not, if you're switching it off and on while it's still reasonably cold, then those very expensive systems in the exhaust, which we now have, will not operate properly. So you could actually emit more pollution than if you kept it running and kept it warm. A lot of vehicles now have got this stop-start technology on them, so it's beginning to come in anyway. And then thirdly, I think we're pretty bad at passing bylaws. I mean, there's lots of things I think we could do, but we don't seem to want to do it, to impose on people. Mostly because a lot of people don't think that they'll be popular and be a vote winner.
Thank you very much for the super talk. Two things. Just as a rough rule of thumb, you mainly talk about these small particles in diesels. For a given vehicle size, is diesel 5 times as bad as petrol, or 10 times, or whatever? So that's one question, fairly quick. The other fascinating thing was you mentioned that these small carbon particles act as carriers of other things into the system. And I saw a program about the fact that these can be carried via the olfactory system straight into the brain, and they found various nasty metals that could only have come from traffic. And I thought that was interesting that you mentioned it was the carbon particles acting as carriers. So thank you for that.
Okay. So to address your question, it's difficult. I believe if you go into the forecourt now and buy equivalent petrol and diesel vehicle, I think the diesel will probably be as good as the petrol. And that's because of the technology that they now have to put on the exhaust system. But if you go back only 2 or 3 years, then the diesel, depending on the manufacturer, it could be 10 times worse. You go back 5 years to 10 years, it could be 20 times worse. So they've really been forced to clean up diesels, but unfortunately, it's too late. You know, they really have got a bad name now, and there's only one direction to travel, and that is just to lower all transport emissions as much as we can, I think.
Could you comment on pollution in the underground?
He's read one of my recent studies. Thank you, John. So, we were asked by Transport for London, this committee I mentioned, COMI, I chair it, and we were asked by the Transport for London to look into air quality on the London Underground. We did all the measurements, we knew what we were going to find, and we recently published the report, which grabbed some headlines. The underground in London is very, very polluted from a particle point of view, but maybe up to 20 times worse than above ground. But the particles that you experience down there are very different from the particles you experience above ground, because they're being generated by the friction of the tires on the wheels on the track, on the power system pickup, and on a century of dirt, basically, that's down there that gets retrained, and all the stuff that comes off us, the commuters, as well. So we know that the concentrations are high, but we don't know if the toxicity of the particles are the same as that above ground, or worse than they are above ground, or are better than less than they are above ground. So that work has to be done. But the bottom line is the underground will have to clean up its act as we move forward. It's a really, really big challenge. And in fact, I can tell you that the initial bit of work, they actually commissioned one of the lines, they commissioned a big cleanup program, and they sent down, I think it was something like 50 workers over a week with their long handled brushes and their mops and everything. And lucky enough, we had the sense to go and put equipment in before they started. So we had that data, and then we measured what was there after they left. And guess what? It was 30% worse when they left. because they had dislodged all this material, which then got entrained when the first train went past. So I sympathize with them, but they have a big problem to deal with. But there's still work to be done on the toxicology side.
So, in the concentration map of London, could not help noticing that on the left-hand side at about 8 o'clock, there's a very big red patch, which happens to coincide with Heathrow Airport. So what is the relative contribution of aviation to the problem?
So well spotted. I don't talk about that, but I always get asked the question. So that map was nitrogen dioxide. And it was lit up around the airport, not because of the planes, but because of the transport of individuals to and from the airport. But that's the reason why Heathrow still doesn't have runway 3 approved. They have to come up with a means of getting the increased number of passengers to and from the airport without leading to further decreases in air quality. We did actually publish another paper last week, and it was on a different pollutant. It was on ultrafine. So these are tiny, tiny, tiny particles, which aviation fuel does generate a lot of. And we actually were able to find these tiny particles in central London. And they were clearly, from the windroses, they were clearly coming in from Heathrow. Now, the impact of ultrafine particle exposure on human health is still a mystery. And it's a mystery because we haven't had the equipment or cheap enough equipment to actually make enough measurements yet to be able to do those studies. But again, that is beginning to change. So that's a story for the future. The aviation itself may be a problem.
You referred to some cells in the lungs which engulf the carbon particles, and then the cells deteriorate. Do they then release the carbon particles to react again?
Good question. And we don't actually know. We can only hypothesize. So under normal circumstances, the old macrophages will move off to areas of the lung which we call lymph nodes, and they'll concentrate there, and they'll basically get degraded down. So these carbon-laden macrophages, we can see those in the lymph nodes when you do examinations and do animal exposures. But whether that carbon then is released back out of the lymph node, we don't know. It could be accumulated there, and it could be moved with the lymph then and excreted from the body in other ways. But in reality, we don't know. I do know that studies in Mexico City, in both autopsies and in dog studies they've done there, they actually have found very blackened areas of the lung where it seemed as if the particles were being concentrated.
Yes, you've mentioned the premature deaths were initially 29,000 and now it's a band of 28 to 36. But 36 would indicate an actual upper band of 36. And I would imagine that as years go on, we find more research, such as the gentleman mentioned about the metals in the brain, I think such as magnetite is highly elevated due to air pollution. And the links between that neural breakdown and the premature deaths coming up from that, it should seem that the upper band should be magnitudes higher that will actually eventually discover how much damage it's been doing.
Yeah, so it's to do with the different types of study. So when you have a study like you're looking at the potential impact of the particles on the brain, and you find evidence for that, you don't straight away, you cannot say, well, everybody that's got Parkinson's or Alzheimer's is due to air pollution exposure. The numbers, that 28 to 36, is derived from population studies where you're comparing one area with another area. These individual disease studies are a different approach to that. But one way that those numbers were also used in the 2010 report was, we think that breathing poor air quality over decades contributes to heart disease, the changing and the furrowing up of your arteries. There, approximately at that point in time, I know the figures come down a bit now, but approximately in 2010, there was 200,000 deaths from heart disease that year. So another way that we can think about it is, no, it's not 29,000, it's up to 200,000 people who are dying from heart disease, and air pollution's contributing some component of that. So it's playing with numbers. That's the way I think about it. And we've got to be totally honest. No one has died from air pollution on their death certificate, but the science says that it contributes to the deterioration of health.
Maybe the last question here, please.
Professor, your subject opens a Pandora's box from what I can gather tonight, because I'm more interested in our worldwide pollution, what others send over to us, because our band of oxygen, breathable oxygen, is very narrow, as we all know. And for instance, if Chernobyl can divert particles to Wales and contaminate, I mean, how there are other, obviously, major health issues in what we breathe. And I wondered whether you are able to detect the air that we, rather like the meteorological pictures we always see, whether we can actually have more direction on where it is safer to live and live longer without breathing in radioactive and agricultural sprays and goodness knows what else.
Yeah, I mean, the understanding we have of weather patterns and wind directions plays a big part in our understanding of why we have pollution increases in certain days. And we have the technology now to understand the chemical components of the pollution which we're seeing in those days. And you're right, sometimes you're able to track that pollution right back to the power stations in Poland. Sometimes you're able to track it back to the Ruhr Valley, the industrial pollutions. And sometimes you're able to track it from the Netherlands, from the agricultural emissions. So it does vary by season and by weather pattern. And again, more sophisticated research going forward will start looking at those individual sources and whether they are more linked or more strongly linked with some of the health outcomes that we've been seeing as well. And then that will help hopefully move policies forward. But already we're already beginning to try and decrease ammonia emissions from farming because it's a big source of what we call secondary particles. Not the primary ones which we get when we burn something, but ones that undergo certain chemistry and make new particles.
Professor Kelly, thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk. Really deep science, leading edge measurement, addressing something that's absolutely topical and at the leading edge of our understanding of what's going on, and something that I think everybody is concerned and fascinated about. Magnificent. Thank you.
Thank you.